thank you for the invite as well. So my name is Clara Bosco. I am the Senior Advisor on Civil Society Resourcing with CIVICUS Global Alliance. I'm calling from an unusually sunny and summery Amsterdam. Mildly daunted to speak after the brilliant intervention of Ever Joyce. But what I wanted to share with you is two key challenges that I think civil society is facing today, and that could stimulate a bit of reflections perhaps around what kind of support and strengthening approaches could be necessary. So sort of just to start, I'd like to share that from where we stand at CIVICUS, we are noticing a discernible rise in closure of civic space around the world, something that really impacts directly the ability of all civil society groups in whichever form and function they have to organize, to speak out, and to take action. And it's very much connected to the rise in authoritarianism and democratic regression trends that we're seeing around the world. And so just to give you some data about the severity of this regression, the latest CIVICUS monitor data points to a situation where over 70% of the world's population lives in countries where civic space is rated as severely restricted or completely closed. And less than 2% of the world's population now live in countries with completely open civic spaces. So that's, for me, something that we always have to keep in mind when we think about the strategies of support, solidarity, accompaniment for the sector. It's very difficult to give a bird's eye view on how this concretely, granularly materializes in civil society organizations, because every context is different. But of course, we see trends that I think could be relevant for this conversation that range from growing tactics to stifle dissent, to discourage speaking out, controlling narratives, and this affects all kinds of groups within civil society, including established civil society organizations, but also protesters, climate activists, defenders, etc. We see a persisting trend in demonizing and targeting particularly minority groups and vulnerable communities. So when we think about civic space, you have to acknowledge that civic space is not affecting homogeneously every type of group in our societies. We continue to see a systematic exclusion of civil society from Global 4, where important global change agendas are discussed, be it the climate financing and climate action or the current global governance reform, things for which civil society has a range of solutions, of ideas, of proposals, and it doesn't get a seat at the table. We see a persisting trend also in sort of more and more disabling laws, regulations, increasing surveillance on operations and finances of civil society, which are accompanied with very problematic narratives revolving around the usual national security concerns, the counterterrorism, but also about public morality and decency, which are really making it hard for civil society to seek, receive, and use support and resources. Which brings me to the second challenge, which is connected, but I wanted to conceptually keep it separate, that I wanted to flag, which is the very challenging resourcing landscape that we see today. So domestically, as I said, the narratives, the laws and restrictions that I've mentioned before not only make it really hard for many groups to operate, but are also having a chilling effect on, for instance, donors domestically or international donors, who are becoming more and more inhibited about supporting certain types of groups, certain types of organizing certain countries. And similarly, and having a chilling effect on important infrastructure, like, for example, the banking system, right, which is becoming more and more cautious about operating, for example, bank accounts for civil society, just to give you an example. But then if we turn to the international support ecosystem, so donors, philanthropy, INGOs, et cetera, what we see is that despite the grand statements that Ever Joyce was mentioning, despite all these grand statements, very, very little has changed, with exceptions of some sort of, with notable exceptions, like I'm sure the feminist funding ecosystem or some thoughtful organizations are still around. But overall, very little has changed. If you think about how much funding goes directly to local groups, there's almost inexistent funding earmarked for grassroots organizing. And I think this connects a little bit with what Ever Joyce was mentioning. There are persistent disparities in kind of the regions that get more allocations for support, the types of grants in terms of size and quality, who gets to those, which also speak to what Marianne and Everjoyce were mentioning, we still see the same access barriers that have been called out for years to access opportunities, and which are fueling the power imbalances that were mentioned already, and I want to repeat. We also see that the quality of resources has not changed, again, despite having asked for years to rethink about the type of resources that are offered, to show the value of flexible multi-year funding, of core funding. We actually don't see much of that. In fact, we see a regression in terms of program funding. It's becoming less and less flexible. We don't understand why, because we thought that during COVID there was a aha moment and people really got it, why flexibility was of the essence. But apparently something is shifting, and for the worse. And we still see that there's a prioritization of very short-term, project-based, depoliticized, single-issue ways of working that are really failing not only to support patient long-term change as it has to be, but also are failing to consider intersectional identities, failing to support critical cross-movement work, all things that I think Everjoyce and Marianne also mentioned. Not to mention problematic behaviors that are still there, in terms of donors and intermediaries. So the consequence of all these is that the civil society groups have been and still are working in a context of scarcity and disparities, and had to learn that the hard way to survive is through competition. And this mentality is really breaking the trust and the collaboration, not only within the sector, but also with the support ecosystem, support infrastructure. And definitely having an impact in the fragmentation and the competition of the sector writ large, which hinders its impact overall and its long-term sustainability. So in terms of what kind of support or what kind of approaches would be needed, I am very pleased to hear from Kate about your mindset. I think it's very aligned with what I was going to say, what I would like to say. And for me, it is key that we start building ecosystems of solidarity that are centered on local groups' needs and visions, and that are more intentionally addressing the global imbalances in the resourcing landscape. This, for me, entails investing more in collective spaces where relationships can be built with the various local groups that would like to support, to deepen mutual understanding, build trust, but also unlearn and relearn together. And I'm just echoing what Marianne is trying to do. We really all need to do this effort of unlearning and relearning together, and redefining what could be valuable modalities of support, of solidarity, of allyship, etc. We also need to coordinate better across the various actors in the support ecosystem, domestically and international, better strategies centered around these needs and priorities elevated by local groups, by local actors, so that we can leverage on each other's vantage points, but in a more joined up and coordinated way. There are a range of mindset shifts that are needed, and I actually see a role for INTRAC there, from moving us from this scarcity and competition mentality to more like resource sharing and co-creation and collaboration, adopting more intersectional and complex approaches in the way we strategize and organize, moving civil society groups away from this donor dependency, the projectified work, and these more depoliticized agendas. And at the same time, we really need to invest in the local support infrastructure. That means serious investments, long-term investments that can build institutions, that can strengthen the credibility and the networks of these support bodies and networks and organizations at all levels. So I think we need to invest morely to experiment, and experiment means trying, succeeding or not succeeding. That's the guess. No, that's the experimenting with alternative approaches of support. That could include, for example, alternative funding models, alternative payment methods, alternative systems of care and solidarity. We need to try things differently. Maybe they don't work. We have to try with intention. We have to be bold. And lastly, and I won't go into details, really, just to repeat myself for the, 10th time this month, more accessible, flexible, nurturing resources, be it financial resources, the core, the multi-year, the flexible, but also non-financial resources. And then I'll stop. we've heard loud and clear that there's a need to hold spaces or to allow groups to have space to come together, to get to know each other, even if it's just to respite, rest, but also to build that trust among them, and then to also strategize together and organize. Thanks.